Back to earth and the realities of life for low-paid Londoners. Major supermarkets provide us with great quantities of easy-to-grab great food from all over the world, but what low-paid staff have to put up with is another matter. The identity of this supermarket worker has been protected.
I work for a major supermarket. I've worked there for 9 years and I get paid just over £6.20 odd an hour. I worked out that I earn less now than I did 9 years ago, and that's quite a shock. We are not getting better off. We're now at a point where we're going back to how I was in my childhood, when we were deemed as poor. My mum had to say to me, you can't go horse riding anymore, you know, we just haven't got the money. And that's why I work extra, and that's why I'm really, really trying hard not to have to say to my kids, you know, you can't do these activities anymore, because that's all I can give them. Whereas I shouldn't have to. I should have the spare money to be able to treat my kids and not feel that I've got to justify it. Every bill that comes through the post, I'm like panicking. You know, the fact that the car could break down or the washing machine could pack up, or, you know, one of us could be ill for any length of time. It's scary because we haven't got any financial backup, and we're having to work extra all the time just to pay bills like normal people do. But also, you know, the cost of everything has gone up so much, and it's not reflected in our wages. It's out of our hands what pay rise we get, you know, what we can demand. No one listens to, you know, it's something that is agreed and we just accept it, or if we don't like it we're told, you know, you don't have to work here. There's these messages coming to us. There's a whole wall of posters saying, you know, we're trying to get the right hours in the right departments. Maybe, you know, you want to drop a night, maybe you want to get contracted for Sunday work so they don't obviously have to pay us the Sunday rate. Do you want parental leave? Do you want extended unpaid holiday pay? Do you want career breaks? It's all aimed at them getting rid of us, if only for a few weeks, and not having to pay us, because they've cut it back to like skeleton staff. But it's the choice you have. You know, you either work there or you don't. That's their motto, really. You don't have to work here.
If this struggle to scrape by is the norm, what campaigns are there taking sides with low paid? Emma Grant reports on one of the few campaigns making low pay and living standards an issue. Emma.
Thanks, Ruji. I'm Emma, reporting for Worldwrite, and we're here at London Citizens to find out more about the living wage campaign. And this is Neil Jameson, the lead organiser, who's been in the campaign from the beginning. Hi, Neil.
Hi.
Can you tell us a little bit more about London Citizens itself to start with, please?
Sure, yeah. London Citizens is London's largest alliance of community groups, faith groups, trade unions, schools, started in 1996, 12 years old now and growing.
Just out of interest of the history of the organisation, as opposed to like a traditional trade union, how come you decided to be a citizens group?
Well, we think in the 21st century, particularly with globalisation, it's not enough to just organise on the workplace. You've got to organise the workplace, the neighbourhood, the church, the mosque, the school.
Do you know what the legal minimum wage is as it stands at the moment?
It's £5.58 at the moment, yeah.
And in terms of holiday and sick pay, like, how does that work? Are all workers entitled to holiday and sick pay?
Yeah. The European rules have just changed, and so no, they're not entitled to sick pay, but they are entitled to 28 days holiday, 8 days public holiday, and 20 days.
Right.
So that's pretty standard now across the place. When we started, that wasn't the case. So the living wage campaign is about conditions of work. Pay is the most important people. When you ask workers, our members, what they want, it's bread on the table, it's cash, primarily they want. So we launched the campaign in 2001 to basically call on all employers to pay what we call a living wage, which people can live on. It's currently now £7.45, so we feel like it's £2 more than the minimum wage. We like the minimum wage, it's okay, but in London it's too low. It's poverty wages, we think. In most cities it's too low. On April the 9th this year, London Citizens had 2,500 people in a Methodist Central Hall, the biggest gathering of the mayoral election, with Mr Johnson and Mr Livingston. We're non-partisan as an alliance, and we ask them both the same question. If elected, will you keep the living wage units? Will you keep it? Will you pay it? And will you announce it once a year based upon inflation and stuff?
I mean, when you sort of work it out, £7.45 is like a massive increase, but yet still it's about £300 a week or something, isn't it? Which realistically is still quite hard for people to live on. I mean, do you campaign for more, and are you still pushing further and further?
Well, it's never enough. I mean, pragmatically, politics, you've got to go for what you can get. It's a tough one to survive on, but it's much better than the £5.58. And it's much better, frankly, than a group of business people fixing what happens with the Low Pay Commission. The Low Pay Commission is made of business leaders and the government, and they come together and they come up with a figure which business can afford. We come together as a civic organisation and say this is what we want. If people don't organise, the market will determine what they get. The fact that the market has encouraged, and the government has encouraged, lots of companies, including local government, to contract out the dirty work and the unsafe work, has meant that employers don't really think about those those employees of the contractor. The business case for living wage is substantial, which is now KPMG and Pricewaterhouse have produced reports to say if you pay a living wage, the turnover of staff drops, the training budget drops, the morale of the staff goes up, the place is clean. That's what they want.
I'm Julie Camacho. I'm originally from Colombia. Been here for 7 years. I took on the living wage campaign at Hilton Hotels and Kensington Hotel. We discovered that time was that because the law is not very strict on the minimum wage or how to pay the minimum wage, then the agencies were taking advantage of that and were paying per room rate, which was a way to steal from the workers' money. And so they were forcing the housekeepers to do 3 rooms per hour. So they would tell them, well, in fact, you're actually earning more than a living wage, because if you do 3 rooms in 1 hour, then you're earning £6, whatever the amount was. And I myself did one of their rooms, and it was absolutely impossible that in 1 hour you could do 3 rooms. People cannot survive on a minimum wage, not in London at least. And so a family cannot afford to pay rent and pay all these other bills with a minimum wage, which is forcing families to go into working in 2 or 3 different jobs throughout the day. A lot of these housekeepers are migrant workers, mostly from East Europe. They don't speak the language, they don't know their rights, and they assume that because they're earning in pounds, it is more money than what they would be earning back home. What they don't realize is that they live in less quality of life. They have to constantly live in rooms where there's 6 people in one room and working 12 hours or 16 hours a day.
And you mentioned they don't know their rights. I mean, in terms of workers' rights, how do you think that stands at the moment, really?
We shouldn't feel sorry for these workers, because a lot of this is the fact that they don't know their rights and they can't speak the language. So part of our campaign is we're also saying to them, well, there are these rights, and as an employee you should be receiving this and that, and you should not be deducted your uniform, and you should not be deducted from your holidays and things like that they don't know they have.
Thanks, Rigi. Back to you in the studio.
Thanks, Emma. We can maybe imagine the outrageous conditions here in the capital facing migrant workers, but it's clear the problem of low pay is far more widespread, as one lorry driver tells. His identity has been protected.
Basically, I'm a lorry driver. I work approximately about 55 hours a week. We get 2 weeks holiday a year, which I feel is not enough. We get bank holidays, which is involved in our holiday as well, which compacted together is supposed to be the amount of holiday that you're entitled to. Sick pay, there is no sick pay. You would go on to statutory sick pay if you was off for any length of time. The pension, there is no pension. We were doing an hour's overtime a night, and the Saturday morning was overtime as well. I've lost the hour a night, and I've also lost the Saturday morning. Without that overtime, I'm approximately £140, £150 a week down, which was what made the wages bearable. With that gone now, I've had to seek other work, basically gardening, bit of landscaping and stuff like that. Through the business that I do, I'm able to get hold of stuff that I can actually do as car boot sale. My wife is she's working extra shifts as and when she can get them because of all the cutbacks in all walks of life, all businesses. They're hard to get a hold of as well. You start sacrificing all over the place. You have to just keep drawing in and drawing in. So the consequence of that is that other things start to suffer. And I don't want that to suffer. I want to stay at the stand I'm living, which is not poor, which is definitely not rich.
In studio to reflect on this report, we have economist and writer Stuart Simpson in discussion with Worldwrite's reporter Saleha Ali. Over to you, Saleha.
Thanks. Hi, Stuart. First of all, can I just get your thoughts on the report? What you thought of it?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that was raised by London citizens was the mention of globalisation. I think this is normally how the issue of low wages is understood. We're in a globalised economy where we're seen to be in competition with low-wage workers in the developing world, such as India and China. But I think it's important to take a step back and realise that when we look at specifically within the UK economy where the low-wage jobs exist, it's not within the industries that are in direct competition with the developing world.
Right.
Where low workers predominate is in sectors such as we saw from the report, within retail, supermarkets, or within hotels or catering, and to a large extent within public services. So everyone knows nurses, teachers, social services. That's where low-wage workers predominate. And from that, I think we need to realise that this isn't some kind of global problem that's outside of our control. This is an entirely domestic situation, and as such is susceptible to domestic policies.
Okay. I mean, so from this perspective, then, what is the case for living standards? So, you know, is it about what businesses can afford to pay, or, you know, is it, you know, just a case of what we need? You know, our living standards defined by what we need.
Yeah. Well, I think on this we need to completely reject the way low wages is normally discussed. So it's normally defined as people who earn less than 60% of the median earnings, which doesn't really mean anything to ordinary people who are on those wages. The one important place to start, I think, was highlighted by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in a report they published earlier in this year. And their starting point was to ask people what kind of standard of living is acceptable to them. And that's where we should start as a wealthy, civilised society, to say, what should we accept? You know, what do we want? What kind of living standards do we want? Do we want holidays every year? Do we want to go to the cinema? Those kind of things. So we really need to start from the position that we're one of the wealthiest economies in the world. And rather than working backwards from a minimum wage, we should work the other way around. What is a decent standard of living?
I mean, one of the things that struck me from the report really was, you know, that people are struggling. You know, they really are finding it hard to get by and everything. But at the same time, they, you know, it seems that they don't have a say. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that came across really strongly in the first interview with the woman who's working for the supermarket. The phrase I think she used was, "It's out of our hands," and I think that's a really problematic situation. And the reason we're in that situation is it's often presented, especially by government who either directly or indirectly employ about a quarter of low-wage earners in the UK. The argument that they put forward a lot of the time is that we need to be prudent and restrict wage increases for fear of stoking inflation and causing economic problems. And we shouldn't have any time for those kind of arguments. The problems of the UK economy are not born out of the fact that teachers earn too much. I think that's nonsense, and everyone would recognise that as nonsense, and we need to be very clear on that. The problems of the UK economy are down to, at the moment, there's particular problems in the financial services, but in a longer-term perspective, we just haven't had the same kind of approach as more successful economies have had, such as Germany, in promoting high-value manufacturing and services. And that's really where we should be focusing our attention. And in doing so, we should recognise that we can increase wages for people who are working essential services and, hotel, catering industries and the other services, business services where people earn low wages. If people in those sectors earn more money, that's not going to cause economic problems. Problems that we have are to be found elsewhere.
Okay, so Stuart, earlier you mentioned that, this is not a global problem, it's a domestic problem that we can deal with over here, and you also said we're one of the richest economies in the world. But on the report, the lady who works at the supermarket said she actually feels poorer today than she did 10 years ago, for example. So is that true? Are we poorer today than we used to be in the past?
Well, of course we're not. The UK economy is far more productive than it was 10 years ago. The amount of wealth we create every year is much more than it was 10 years ago. The problem that we're in at the moment is that certain specific sectors of the economy are being left out of that increase in wealth. So as I said before, that's why it's important to focus on what's particularly happening in different sectors of the economy.
Right.
So one of the main areas, as we referred to earlier, is public services. Now, it's important to understand how, what the response to that is, what the response to low wages for teachers or nurses, for instance, is. Instead of people demanding higher wages, people who work in those areas are referred to by the government as key workers. And so there's this discussion that certain jobs are essential and important, more important than others. And there's almost a moral classification about the type of work that people do. So the way the discussion plays out is that these people should be entitled to subsidised housing, for instance. But at the same time, because they're involved in a vocation rather than just doing a job, they should accept lower wages because what they're doing, it has a moral purpose to it, which is entirely unacceptable. What's even worse than that, though, is the contract cleaners, for instance, who clean offices for public servants, who aren't classified as key workers, are just left out of the picture altogether. And especially when we've talked about earlier the fact that we are a very wealthy economy, the fact that huge sections of the population, a significant number of people are left out of that increase in wealth, is something that, as a society, we should see is as completely unacceptable.
Why have we stopped fighting? Why do you think we've stopped asking for more?
Well, I think one of the problems is the idea of increased affluence is becoming more and more problematic. So, for instance, 50 years ago, the discussion of redistribution was a discussion about how we more equitably apportion increased affluence in society. Whereas today, when we discuss redistribution, we're talking about the fact that there are limits. So part of the discussion focuses on people who earn too much, so city bankers who take in huge six-figure bonuses. And then another part of the discussion focuses on the fact that we live in a consumer culture, a wasteful culture, a throwaway society. And this really hits people on low wages harder than anybody else. What people discuss is clothing stores like Primark, for instance, which are seen to be problematic because it encourages waste. People can buy clothes cheaply and then throw them away. So rather than seeing this as a benefit from economic growth, we see this as we portray this as a problem. This has the effect of hitting people on the lowest wages harder than anybody else, because this is one of the real benefits that we've had over the past 10, 15 years, and that's talked about as if that's a problem.
So then we do have more. You're not advocating redistribution, for example?
Well, like I said, redistribution today is discussed differently from what it was in the past. There's a progressive sense of what redistribution should mean, a share in increased affluence. Which is not how it's discussed today. It's discussed in terms of limits. But I think also importantly, on the issue of redistribution, then we should recognise that that's effectively how modern economies work. So the services and sectors of the economy with low wages are not particularly productive sectors. They don't add to the general wealth of society in the way that high-value manufacturing or other services do. So, to put that as a concrete example, then a bus driver in London is no more productive than a bus driver in Beijing. Right. But the bus driver in London earns a hell of a lot more than the person in Beijing. And part of the reason that is because the UK economy as a whole has high-value manufacturing and service sectors, which create and drive the wealth of the economy. So people who work in what are now low-wage sectors of the economy, their wages really depend on what goes on in the rest of the economy. Mm-hmm. So we need a focus on low wages which talks about how we create affluence in society. We need a broader view of how we develop the UK economy. That should include making sure that essential parts of the economy, which aren't the motor of the economy but are essential, such as health and education, sharing those benefits. But the key is to talk about how we create that wealth in the first place.
So what about the credit crunch then? I mean, should we be tightening our belts, watching our pennies? What do you think?
Well, unfortunately for a lot of people it's not a matter of choice. We're seeing increasing inflation, which again hurts people on low wages more than everybody else. So high food prices, utility bills, cuts into the low disposable incomes that those people have already. But I think generally, again, we need to take a longer term view, and what's been lacking in the events of the recent years or months, rather, is a sense of purpose and leadership from the political elite of this country. We need to have a view of not what's going to take place in the next year or two, but what's going to take place in the next generation or two. Right. And to do that, we need to focus more, as I said, on where wealth is created in the economy. So a good example, it might seem ironic now, but a good example of a sensible policy that's created high-wage jobs is the financial centre in the Docklands, which is a perfect example of a successful industrial cluster. This is where we should learn from countries like China, actually, who have done a lot to promote their economic growth through those kind of policies. But it's not just China that's done that. If we look at the countries that we do compete directly with, such as Germany or the United States, they, despite the United States being seen as cowboy capitalism and free markets, if you look at the most successful government-sponsored industrial cluster in the world, it's Silicon Valley. And that didn't happen by accident. That was a direct consequence of policies enacted by the people who run California and run business in California. And these things don't happen by chance. But we've got ourselves into the situation in this country where over the past 10 or 15 years we talk of living in a post-industrial society, knowledge-based economy, which has been amazingly beneficial for the City of London and financial services, but it's been amazingly damaging for the rest of the economy.
Okay, thanks Stuart, that was all very, very interesting. And back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Salha and Stuart.